There's no doubt that one of the best lures there is to catch a bass is a chatterbait, also known as a bladed jig. Ever since chatterbaits and bladed jigs came out, they have really dominated a lot of tournaments. But whether you're a tournament fisherman or not, a chatterbait is a great tool that we have to simply go out and catch a lot of bass. It doesn't matter whether you fish big lakes, rivers, ponds, for largemouth, smallmouth, or spotted bass, a chatterbait can be a deadly lure. Today is about breaking down that chatterbait and learning everything about it, so stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Speaking of chatterbaits and bladed jigs, you can actually get a big discount on some of your favorite bladed jigs right now at sportsmansoutfitters.com. Right now they're having a cabin fever sale. Some of your favorite bladed jigs like the jackhammer, which are typically $17, $18, $19, are just $13.99 at Sportsman's Outfitters right now. And other baits like the Z-Man TRD and the Berkeley Stunner, you can get them all at a big discount right now. So click that link down below in the description for sportsmansoutfitters.com. I don't actually remember when I first picked up a chatterbait, but I do remember the first fish that I caught on it, and it was a 5-pound, 7-ounce bass. From there, you might say that I was hooked on the chatterbait. Since then, I've used bladed jigs not only in my home state of Ohio, but also down in Florida and in South Carolina, in Mississippi, Alabama, New York, Michigan. It doesn't matter where you're located in the country, the chatterbait is a great tool that will help you catch bass year-round. For those of you who may be new to the chatterbait, anytime I say chatterbait in this video, I'm really referring to all bladed jigs. The chatterbait was the first of its kind of like Kleenex is to tissue. Ever since then, pretty much every major lure manufacturer has come out with their own version of a bladed jig. And it seems like almost all of them catch fish really, really well. Now, if you look at a chatterbait, it's basically like a jig and a crankbait put together. You kind of have the body of a jig with a jig head and a skirt and a large single hook, but then you have the blade that is attached to that jig head. But the other thing is you really almost fish it like a spinnerbait. So it's really kind of a mix between a jig, crankbait, and a spinnerbait. Now, most of the time when you're fishing the chatterbait or any other type of bladed jig, you're going to be adding some sort of trailer to the back of that bait. Now, I'm not saying you can't get bit just using the chatterbait without a trailer, but a lot of times adding a trailer is gonna have a lot more benefits than fishing it without that trailer. As the bait comes through the water, the blade is gonna vibrate hard back and forth. That's gonna put out a lot of vibration. It's gonna move a lot of water, which really allows bass to hone in on it, even if they're in dirty water, by using their lateral line. Now, I have actually taken underwater footage of a lot of different bladed jigs before on this channel, and I'll link those videos down below for you to see. But the big thing that I've noticed with a bladed jig is no bladed jig is created equal. Some run deeper in the water column, some run higher in the water column, some have a bigger shimmy back and forth, some kind of hunt back and forth. They're all a little bit different, but if you're just getting started, I would just suggest going with anything in that Z-Man chatterbait line. A little bit later in this video, I'm gonna get into some specifics about colors and different bladed jigs that you can use. But before we do that, let's talk about when, where, and how to fish a chatterbait. One of the best characteristics about a chatterbait is that it is a lure that you can use year-round. I've caught bass on bladed jigs and chatterbaits winter, spring, summer, fall, anytime that water temp is really above probably 46, 47 degrees and higher, you can catch bass on a chatterbait. That's really why I think it's so important that you understand everything there is about bladed jigs, because again, it's a lure that works at all times. So no matter where you go, no matter what kind of body of water you are fishing, you should just always have some bladed jigs, some chatterbaits with you, even have them rigged up so that you can go out and catch fish. Now, one thing that's important to know about a chatterbait is there are certain conditions where it seems like the chatterbait will produce bass better than others. A lot of times when I am using a lure that is loud, that has a lot of vibration, that moves a lot of water, I tend to like a little bit louder conditions for that bait bait to work the best. So what I mean by loud conditions, sometimes this can simply be having some sort of wind on the water, especially if you're fishing in clear water situations. If you're fishing a very clear body of water and there's no wind out there, there's probably other lures that are gonna work better than a chatterbait. Having that chop on the water really kind of breaks down how far a bass can see and how well that they can see. So when you have that chop, the bass seem to commit to that bait as opposed to following it all the time. Now, another condition that I would consider being loud is anytime you have a high stain or muddy water. If you have low visibility in your water, very muddy, very stained, very dark water, a chatterbait can be a great bait almost anytime in that situation. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite patterns is actually seeking out some stained water during the spring to go throw a chatterbait around wood cover and anything that's available that I think a bass would set up on. Now, if you don't have wind and you don't have low visibility water, another time that the chatterbait may work well is when you have really cloudy conditions. Again, the cloudy conditions are gonna cut down on the visibility, and it seems like the bass just tend to commit to that bait more. But really, as I say with just about any lure out there, if the bass are biting it, the bass are biting it. So no matter the conditions, you can always test it out. If you're getting bit on it, then keep fishing it. Now, I just want to let you guys know I am going to talk about all my chatterbait equipment that I like to use at the end of the video. But I really think it's more important to know when, where, and how to fish a chatterbait before we talk about all that kind of stuff. When it comes to where you can fish a chatterbait, to be honest, the options are pretty much endless. You can really fish this bait wherever you want to fish it. Now, with that being said, there are a few type of areas. There are a few type of pieces of cover, things that I look for where when I see them, I'm like, all right, a chatterbait is definitely gonna work here. I fish a chatterbait most of the time less than about 5 or 6 foot of water. Now, over the last couple of years, they've actually come out with some chatterbaits that are actually really heavy. Baits that are over an ounce of weight, and having a bait that's over an ounce in weight really allows you to fish that bait deeper in 10, 15, 20 foot of water. For instance, if you fish a lot in the Tennessee River and you're fishing a lot of ledges that are in that kind of 10 to 15 foot zone, instead of throwing a crankbait or instead of throwing a jig, a great option might be to throw one of those heavier chatterbaits and actually work it on the bottom kind of like you would a jig, or actually creep it slowly across the bottom. There's no doubt that that would be a great way to mimic one of those bigger gizzard shad that's in that Tennessee strain of lakes. But again, I primarily fish the chatterbait pretty shallow, and one of the first things that I look for is any type of grass. Really, if you think about it, almost any type of vegetation, whether this is a submergent vegetation like coontail or milfoil or hydrilla, or if this is an emergent type of vegetation like reeds or cattails, pretty much anytime I'm around vegetation, I'm gonna pick up the chatterbait. And one of the biggest reasons is that it simply comes through that vegetation better than a lot of lures. Now, I'm not saying it's always the best lure to use in that situation, but a lot of times if I find myself fishing around vegetation of any sort, more than likely I'm gonna have a chatterbait on the front deck of the boat. And for you guys who thought that this is a green screen behind me, that is a boat. Now, another time that I'm always gonna have a chatterbait or bladed jig rigged up is anytime I'm fishing around docks. And one of the biggest reasons that I like to fish a chatterbait around a dock is because you can skip a chatterbait very, very well. You can skip it way up underneath of a dock, just like you can skip a jig up underneath of a dock. And there's a lot of times when you're fishing around a dock that the bass are actually suspended. For instance, you may be fishing over 20 and 30 foot of water on a big marina dock, but those fish are just below the surface. They may only be 2-3 foot down. That's a great situation where the chatterbait can be dynamite where other lures may fail. But even if you're not fishing really, really deep docks, even if you're fishing docks that are in 5 and 6 foot of water, sometimes bass will still suspend maybe 2-3 foot. Maybe they're just kind of hanging around the middle of that water column. And in those situations, yeah, you might be able to catch fish, on a jig, skipping a jig up under there, or a Texas rig, but sometimes you will get more bites or bigger bites by fishing a chatterbait and keeping that bait around that level that those bass are sitting. Another place that I love fishing a chatterbait is actually down riprap banks. I think a lot of guys, when they go out there fishing and they see a riprap bank, there's a lot of different lure choices that's gonna come to their mind. For instance, a square bill crankbait might be one of the first things that you think of, or possibly a spinnerbait, or even some sort of topwater bait, or maybe even a jig. So with that being said, because other guys are thinking about throwing different lures, that is why a chatterbait can work so well in that situation. If the bass that are living on riprap banks are typically seeing square bills and spinner baits and jigs, they may just get used to the vibration and the water displacement that those lures put off. And then all of a sudden a chatterbait comes flying past them with a different vibration, a different look, and they can really munch on it when you're fishing around riprap. Now, another situation which is similar to the riprap is when I'm fishing around wood cover. Again, a lot of guys, when they see wood, a lot of times they're not always thinking about a chatterbait. Now, one of the biggest reasons a lot of guys don't fish a chatterbait around wood is that if you are using the wrong type of trailer on your chatterbait, that chatterbait actually gets hung up on wood cover a lot. So it's extremely important to use the right type of trailer to match with the cover that you are fishing. And again, we're gonna get into the bait, the colors, the trailers, and stuff like that at the very end. But fishing the right trailer around wood cover, that bait comes through that wood cover actually pretty well. And again, a lot of guys are gonna be thinking about throwing a spinnerbait or flipping some sort of soft plastic around that wood cover, and you show them a different presentation and the bass can really hammer a chatterbait around wood cover. Now, the last place that I really love fishing that chatterbait is pretty much any time I'm out there pond fishing. The thing is about a pond is that you typically have a mucky bottom in a lot of ponds. And if it's not a mucky or muddy bottom, sometimes you just have a little bit of that grass, a little bit of that pond scum at the bottom of the pond. And so fishing lures like crankbaits or even bottom bouncing baits can kind of be a struggle at times because you're gonna get that bait in that scum and in that muck and it can foul up your lure a lot. And the other thing is that the fish tend to stay off of that bottom a little bit. They don't always like to pick stuff off of that mucky bottom. So a chatterbait is a great bait to fish anytime you're fishing in a pond because you can keep that bait higher in the water column. Bass tend to like to go up to eat a bait. They don't always love to go down. So you can keep that bait above them in the water column, fishing it in a pond, and you're gonna catch a lot of bass with the chatterbait, the bladed jig. Now, when it comes to how I like to fish a chatterbait, there's really three main retrieves that I have learned with the chatterbait that work really, really well. Now, a lot of guys are gonna pick up that bait, they're gonna cast it out, and they're gonna reel it straight back in. And yes, that will catch you some fish from time to time, but one thing that you can do pretty much with any lure, not just a chatterbait, is if you vary that retrieve, if you speed it up a little at times, slow it down, pause it and let that bait fall for a couple of seconds and then keep on going. Doing that during a retrieve, adding those little twitches really helps you to actually get more bites out on the water because it's going to trigger bass to eating that bait. Sometimes bass are following that bait, they don't know whether they want to bite it, and then all of a sudden you speed it up or you kill it and that bait falls and bam, that's when a bass gets it. So anytime I am fishing a chatterbait, anytime, I'm always going to change up my retrieve, add a couple of twitches, add a couple of pauses to that bait to help me get a lot more bites with the bladed jig. Now, one of my favorite ways to actually fish the bladed jig, a chatterbait, is actually working it a lot more like a jig than you would a spinnerbait. Typically when I do this is anytime I'm fishing that offshore grass. If I'm fishing hydrilla or milfoil that is offshore, maybe it's in 7 or 8 foot of water, maybe it's coming up to the surface, maybe I have a hard edge. A lot of times one of the best things you can do is cast that bait out, let it sink into the grass, rip it out and let it fall back down. And you're gonna keep ripping it out and letting it fall back down. And you're constantly kind of letting that bait get into the grass, ripping it out, and letting it fall down. Now, I've actually seen it before on certain lakes, especially lakes down in Florida, like the Harris Chain of Lakes or Lake Toho, Kissimmee. Some of those lakes, I have actually seen it where you will not get bit on a chatterbait if you are not working it in that manner. If you're casting that bait out and reeling it, and then every now and then you're killing it and pausing it, kind of like what we talked about earlier, you're actually not going to get bites. But if you rip that bait out and let it fall a ways, sometimes that is the way that bass really like that bait. Now, something that I want to experiment a little bit more with this year is actually using different bladed jigs when I'm working it in that manner. Because what I found out this year is that some bladed jigs actually fall a lot differently than others. For instance, the Guggenbait clickbait, as it falls to the bottom, it actually kind of shimmies back and forth. And anytime you have a bait that has that shimmying action, like a Cinco or like a Strike King red eye shad, anytime you have that shimmy on the way down, it seems like bass really like that. So that is something I'm gonna experiment with a lot more this year when I come to those situations where I'm fishing the chatterbait that way. Now, another way that I love to fish a chatterbait is actually slow rolling the bait. And this is something that I don't think a ton of guys do, because I think that they think a chatterbait's going to get hung up, but a chatterbait, a bladed jig, is actually a great bait to just kind of slow roll across the bottom. Now, again, I'm saying slow roll, but still, if I'm slow rolling it, every now and then I'll lift that rod up, let that bait fall, I'll speed it up, I'll slow it down. I'm always varying the retrieve, but for the most part, I'm kind of creeping this bait. And this is something that I actually learned in Ohio. There's a lake in Ohio that I used to fish crankbaits on all the time. But the thing is a lot of other guys always fish crankbaits as well. Like, everybody was out there slinging away crankbaits. I decided one day, you know what, I'm gonna pick up a chatterbait and I'm gonna fish it kind of like I would a crankbait. I'm gonna get it there pretty much on the bottom and slow roll that bait. And I started doing that and it was immediate. I started catching fish. I started catching more fish than the guy that was fishing in front of me that day who was fishing a crankbait. And I learned that day how well slow rolling a chatterbait can be, especially if you're fishing in a lake like that. If you're fishing around a lake that just crankbaits are notorious for being a great bait, you know, sometimes that's lakes like Table Rock Lake or Bull Shoals Lake, you know, those lakes are kind of known as crankbait lakes. Slow rolling that chatterbait is a great way to do something different and get a lot of bites. Now, the last way that I fish it is pretty much the standard way. It's kind of like fishing it like a spinnerbait. Anywhere I'm gonna fish a spinnerbait, I'm gonna fish the chatterbait, but again, that's mostly just casting it out and reeling in, but during that retrieve, again, speeding it up, slowing it down, letting it fall from time to time, that's greatly gonna help you to get more bites on a chatterbait. I really hope that kind of tells you the when, where, and how to fish a chatterbait. Now let's actually talk about the bait itself and some of the equipment that I use to get the job done. Real quick, I wanna talk about your rod, reel, and line. As far as your reel goes, I like a reel that's somewhere in that 6.3 to 1 gear ratio. Something that's not too fast, but not too slow. You could also use a 7.1, and I wouldn't use anything over that 7.1. When it comes to the line itself, I use 20-pound fluorocarbon probably 80% of the time. Now, sometimes I will step down to 15-pound fluorocarbon. Using that 15-pound fluorocarbon helps me to get that bait deeper. Now, when it comes to a rod, there's several rods on the market that are actually made for chatterbaits. And what I have found out is that I want a parabolic bending rod first and foremost. Whether you want to use a composite rod, which is glass and graphite mix, or whether that's just a straight graphite rod, that moderate action, more of a parabolic action, that's what you want. Typically, I want a medium heavy power and a moderate action. That seems to be the best when it comes to fishing a chatterbait. What that moderate action does is it really allows that bass to kind of get that chatterbait a little bit better. As the bass opens its mouth and that bait starts to go backwards, you're gonna feel that a lot quicker if you have a fast action rod. Sometimes you're gonna set the hook quicker and you're gonna miss that rod. That moderate action, when that fish opens its mouth, it actually goes into the fish's mouth deeper before you really feel it, allowing you to get a better hookup with that bass. So moderate action on your rod, whether it's a graphite rod or composite, I really think that moderate action, that parabolic bend, is the most important element. Now, when it comes to fishing a bladed jig, I throw the Z-Man Evergreen Jackhammer a lot. Now, the only thing about this bait is it is a little bit expensive, although, like I told you earlier, at Sportsman's Outfitters, I think you can get them for $13.99 right now, which is a great deal. But I really, really love the Jackhammer. It's really the top of the line when it comes to bladed jigs. Now, with that being said, I also really like the original Chatterbait. It has a great sound in the water, and if you are just getting started with fishing a bladed jig, that is what I'm going to suggest that you use, is just the original Chatterbait. It's going to work very, very well. It's going to get bit. Now, another one of my favorite bladed jigs is the Strike King Thunder Cricket. Something I've noticed about the Thunder Cricket is it tends to get down a little bit more than a jackhammer or like the original Chatterbait. What I mean by that, if you have a 1/2 ounce jackhammer and a 1/2 ounce Thunder Cricket, and you cast those out and you reel them at the same pace, the Thunder Cricket will actually get a little bit deeper than the jackhammer. And I'm guessing that has to do with the blade shape. It probably doesn't catch as much water, which makes it get down a little bit more. But anytime I'm fishing a little bit deeper, maybe deeper grass, that's a bait that I really like to use. Now, one of my favorite bladed jigs right now is the Big Blade Chatterbait. This is a bait that just came onto the market over the last year or so, and it's a great bait. Now, something that I like about it is because it has a bigger blade on it, it's gonna put out a different vibration. So if you go to lakes where everybody's fishing a chatterbait or a bladed jig, throwing that big blade is just something different. It feels different to the bass, and because of that, a lot of times you will catch more fish on a big blade than you will the other baits. Another time I'm gonna fish that big blade is anytime I have very, very loud conditions. If it's raining and windy and cloudy, if it's really muddy water, any of those situations, I'm gonna use that big blade to put out more vibration to really help that bass hone in on that bait. Another chatterbait that I really like is the Stealth Blade Chatterbait. This blade's a lot different than the other blades. It's not gonna put out quite as much vibration. I tend to use this bait a lot when I'm fishing in highly pressured bodies of water, clear bodies of water, or if I'm fishing for smallmouth. It seems like a lot of smallmouth fisheries, you're typically around clearer water, and that Stealth Blade can really be deadly for a smallmouth. Now, let's talk about trailers. I used to put a Senko on the back of a lot of my chatterbaits, and I still do that from time to time. And as you guys know about a Senko, if you're bringing it through the water column, it's not like it has a boot tail like a swim bait. It's really just kind of riding on the chatterbait. The thing is you don't need a trailer that has a lot of action. The bladed jig and the chatterbait is simply vibrating constantly. So that tail of a Senko being on there is gonna go back and forth. It's gonna go crazy because the motor of that lure, which is the chatterbait, is going crazy. That's also why I love the Yamamoto Seiko trailer. This trailer, you know, if you put it on a jig head and reeled it back to you, it really doesn't have a lot of action. But you put it on a chatterbait and it has a ton of action. And again, it's gonna be going back and forth. But the reason that I like the Seiko better than other trailers, the Seiko or Zako, depending on how you say it, the back of it was actually designed that when a fish hits it, it actually crumples up and allows the fish to get the hook a little bit better. So if you're fishing a fishery that has smaller fish, maybe you're catching a lot of 1 to 2 pound fish, or the fish are just kind of nipping at the bait, I really think that Zako helps you to hook up with more fish. Now, anytime I'm fishing the bait kind of in the open or around grass, I typically use the Seiko trailer. The other trailer that I really like to use is the Strike King Rage Tail Structure Bug. Earlier, when I talked about fishing a trailer through wood cover, this is the trailer that you want to use. And you don't want to rig it vertically, you actually want to rig it horizontally on the bait. If you rig this horizontally on the bait, it actually keeps the bait from rolling side to side. That rolling action is what makes that bait hook up when you're fishing it around wood and limbs. If you have this bait on the back of a chatterbait, it really comes through that wood cover a lot more efficiently. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about with bladed jigs and chatterbaits is color selection. And I actually did a video right here that's all about color selection with your chatterbaits, when I like to use certain colors versus others, and what my top colors are. So click on that video if you want to watch that. Subscribe to this channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.